Spoilers ahead. Rick Grimes didn't become a monster because the world forced him to. He became a monster because he convinced himself that becoming one was the only way to protect the people he loved. And the difference between those two things is the difference between tragic necessity and willing transformation. And if you go back and watch his first kill, the way he hesitates, the way he looks at the gun like it's a foreign object, even though he's a trained police officer, you'll see the exact moment he makes a choice that he'll spend the rest of the series pretending wasn't a choice at all. The show frames Rick's arc as a story of a good man forced to do terrible things in a terrible world. And on the surface, that reading makes sense because the world of The Walking Dead is objectively terrible. Walkers everywhere, resources scarce, other survivors often more dangerous than the dead. And Rick is positioned as a reluctant leader who has to make the hard calls that other people won't make, who has to get his hands bloody so that his family and his group can stay clean. And that framing is seductive because it makes his transformation feel inevitable, like he didn't have a choice, like anyone in his position would have done the same things. But the show also gives us a character who proves that reading wrong, and his name is Hershel Green. Hershel exists in the same world as Rick, faces the same threats, loses people he loves just like Rick does, and yet Hershel never stops believing that there's a way to survive without losing your humanity, that the measure whether you've actually survived isn't just whether you're still breathing, but whether you've held on to things that make life worth living in the first place. And Rick watches Hershel die for holding on to that belief, watches the governor cut his head off in front of everyone, and instead of seeing that as a tragedy, Rick internalizes it as proof that Hershel's way doesn't work, that the only people who survive are the ones willing to do what Hershel wouldn't do. And that's the moment Rick fully commits to the lie he's been telling himself since Shane, which is that brutality isn't a choice, it's a requirement. But let's talk about Shane for a second, because Shane is a ghost that haunts Rick's entire arc. And the show wants you to believe that Rick killed Shane in self-defense, that Shane had become too dangerous, too unstable, that he was a threat to Carl and Lori and the whole group, and all of that is technically true. But it's also true that Shane saw the world clearly from the beginning, understood that the old rules didn't apply anymore, that survival meant making decisions based on cold calculation rather than sentimental attachment to the way things used to be, and Rick killed him for it. Not because Shane was wrong, but because Shane represented what Rick was afraid of becoming. And then Rick spent the next several seasons becoming exactly that while telling himself it was different. It was necessary. It was leadership. Every major decision Rick makes after Shane's death follows the same pattern, which is Rick identifying a threat, trying the diplomatic approach, because that's what leaders are supposed to do, watching the diplomatic approach fail or backfire, and then responding with overwhelming violence while framing it as the only option left. And this pattern repeats so consistently that it stops being about survival and starts being about identity, because Rick isn't just protecting his people. He's proving to himself over and over again that Shane was right, that the world requires monsters. And if the world requires monsters, then Rick isn't choosing to be one. He's just accepting reality, which is psychologically much easier than admitting that he likes the power, likes the fear in people's eyes when he makes a threat, likes being the person who decides who lives and who dies, because that's the kind of control you don't get to have in normal life, even as a cop. The Terminus arc is where this really crystallizes, because Rick and the group get captured, they're about to be butchered and eaten, and Rick leads them out with brutal efficiency, killing every single person at Terminus without hesitation. And the show plays this as a triumphant moment, Rick becoming the warrior his people need. But watch his face during that sequence. Watch how easily the violence comes, how little it seems to bother him compared to his first kill back in season 1. And what you're seeing isn't someone doing what he has to do. You're seeing someone doing what he's good at, and there's a difference. Then there's Alexandria, which is the show's clearest test of whether Rick has actually changed or whether he's just adapted to chaos. Because Alexandria is a functioning community, people living relatively normal lives behind walls. And Rick's group arrives, and immediately Rick starts seeing threats everywhere. Not because the threats are necessarily real, but because Rick has been living in survival mode for so long that he doesn't know how to turn it off. And his solution isn't to try to reintegrate, to relearn how to live in a community where not every problem requires violence. Instead, his solution is to take over, to impose his way of doing things on people who survive just fine without him, and he justifies this by saying he's protecting them from themselves, that they're naive, soft, unprepared for the real world, But what he's actually doing is recreating conditions that make him necessary. Because if Alexandria can function without becoming brutal, then Rick doesn't get to be special anymore. He's just a traumatized man who's very good at killing people, and that's not an identity he's ready to accept. The Savior's arc takes this even further. Because Negan is explicitly positioned as what Rick would become if he went just a little bit further, Negan rules through fear and violence and charisma, just like Rick does. He makes speeches about how his way is the only way to survive, just like Rick does. He kills people to make examples, just like Rick does. And the only real difference between them is that Negan admits what he is while Rick still pretends he's doing it for noble reasons, still frames every brutal act as reluctant necessity. And the war between Rick and Negan isn't really about freedom or justice. It's about two men who built their entire identities around being the alpha survivor, refusing to submit to someone else's version of the same basic philosophy. And then Carl dies, and Carl's last words to Rick are a plea for him to stop, to find a better way, to build something instead of just destroying threats. And Carl's vision is the same vision Hershel had, the same vision that Rick has been rejecting for years, because accepting it would mean accepting that all the brutality, all the killing, all the times he chose violence over alternatives, those weren't necessary. They were just easier, and Rick has built too much of his identity on the idea that he's the man who makes the hard choices to suddenly pivot and admit that maybe the hard choice isn't always a violent one. Maybe the hard choice is choosing mercy when violence would be simpler. The show's actual ending has Rick leave, get taken by the CRM, and the implication is that he's going to spend years trying to get back to his family, try to get back to the community he helped build. But that ending doesn't actually resolve the central contradiction of his character, which is that Rick never figured out how to be a leader without being a warlord, never learned how to protect people without becoming the thing they need protection from. And his departure doesn't change the fact that he trained an entire generation of survivors to think like him, to see threats everywhere, to respond to problems with overwhelming force. And that legacy is what dooms communities like Alexandria and Hilltop and the Kingdom to constant warfare long after Rick is gone. So, what would a psychologically consistent ending look like? One that actually engages with who Rick became rather than just removing him from the board so the show can continue without him? First, Rick survives the bridge explosion, but he doesn't get taken by the CRM. Instead, he wakes up alone, separated from everyone, and instead of immediately trying to find his way back, he actually stops, actually sits with what he's become and what it's cost, because for the first time in years, he's not responsible for anyone else's survival. He doesn't have to be the leader, doesn't have to make the hard calls, and without that role to perform, he has to confront the fact that he doesn't know who he is anymore without it. That somewhere between the farm and Terminus and Alexandria and the Saviors, he stopped being Rick Grimes a person and became Rick Grimes a symbol. And symbols don't get to retire. They don't get to admit they were wrong. They don't get to change. Second, instead of trying to get back to Alexandria, Rick does something he's never done before in the entire series, which is walk away. Not because he doesn't love his family, not because he doesn't care about the communities, but because he finally understands what Carl was trying to tell him, which is that his way of leadership, his way of protecting people, it doesn't build anything. It just creates cycles of violence that require constant management. And the only way to break that cycle is for him to stop being the person everyone looks to when they need someone killed. And that means leaving completely, permanently, letting Michonne and Daryl and the others figure out how to lead without him, how to build without him, how to survive without turning into him. Third, and this is the part that would never happen in the actual show but would be psychologically consistent with the character, Rick finds a small community somewhere far from everything he's built, a place where no one knows who he is or what he's done. And he doesn't try to take over, doesn't try to impose his rules, doesn't position himself as a person with all the answers. Instead, he just lives quietly, doing whatever work needs doing, helping when asked but never volunteering to be the leader. And it's hard. It's maybe the hardest thing he's ever done because his entire identity for years has been wrapped up in being indispensable, being the one person who can make the impossible decisions, and learning to be just another person, just another survivor with no special status or authority. That's the real challenge, not fighting walkers or hostile groups, but fighting his own need to be necessary. And in this version, Michonne eventually finds him, because of course she does. She's Michonne. And she's angry at first, angry that he left, angry that he let everyone believe he was dead. But then she sees what he's built, or more accurately, what he hasn't built. Sees that he's not trying to be king of this small community, not trying to turn it into another Alexandria, and she understands, maybe for first time, what Carl's death actually did to him, which wasn't just grief, it was the shattering of the entire framework he'd used to justify everything he'd done since Shane. Because if Carl, his son, the person he was ostensibly protecting all along, if Carl died believing that Rick's way was wrong, then what was it all for? They talk, and Rick doesn't ask to come back, doesn't ask her to stay. He just tells her the truth, which is that he loved being the leader, loved the power and the certainty, and the way people looked at him like he was the only thing standing between them and chaos. And that love scared him more than Walker's ever did. Because it meant that somewhere along the way he stopped doing terrible things because he had to and started doing them because he could, because the world gave him permission. And the only way he could stop was to remove himself from any situation where that version of him would be useful, would be necessary, would be celebrated. Michonne goes back to Alexandria, and she tells people the truth, that Rick is alive, but he's not coming back. And some people are angry. Some people feel betrayed. But others, the ones who knew him best, they understand that Rick leaving is the first truly selfless thing he's done in years. Because stay would mean continuing to be the warlord, continuing to be the person who solves problems with violence, continuing to train the next generation to think the only way to survive is to become monsters. And leaving means giving the chance to find a different way. Carl's way, Hershel's way, the way Rick could never quite believe in, because believing in it would mean admitting that he chose brutality when he could have chosen something else. The final scene is Rick alone in this small community years later, older, quieter, not the warrior king anymore, just a man who works in a garden and helps repair walls and listens when people talk instead of telling them what to do. And he's not happy exactly, because people who've done what he's done don't get to be happy. But he's at peace in a way he never was when he was leading armies and making speeches about how they're the ones who live. And the last image is him looking at a photo of Carl, the one where Carl is smiling before everything went wrong. And Rick doesn't say anything, doesn't make a speech, doesn't frame it as noble sacrifice or necessary evil. He just looks at it, and you can see in his eyes that he knows the truth, which is that Carl was right, that there was always another way, and Rick just chose not to see it until it was too late to matter for anyone except himself. That's the ending that would be true to who Rick actually became, not the hero reluctantly doing terrible things, but the man who discovered he was good at terrible things and built an entire identity around justifying them. And the only redemption available to someone like that isn't death, isn't heroic sacrifice, isn't going out in a blaze of glory. It's just a quiet, uncomfortable work of learning to be nobody special, nobody important, nobody necessary, just another person trying to survive without making the world worse. And for someone who spent years believing he was the only person who could hold everything together, that's a fate worse than death, which is why it's the only ending that would actually mean something.